Good day, everyone. I am Waljime Kobiu, one of the reporter of the Module 6, which is the laws concerning marriage and family. So, I'm going to discuss about the chapter 3, system of absolute community, and it tackles about Section 1, General Provisions. Section 2, What constitutes family property. Section 3, Charges and obligations of the absolute community. And Section 4, Ownership and administrative enjoyment and disposition. First, we have the definition of terms. Prenuptial agreement. A prenuptial agreement, also known as the premarital agreement or antenuptial contract, is a legally binding contract that couples enter into before marriage. Community property. Community property refers to assets and debts acquired by a couple during their marriage, where both spouses are considered co-owners. It's a legal concept that applies in many jurisdictions, including the Philippines. Judicial separation of property. This is a legal process where the court separates the property of the spouses, effectively ending the community property regime. Liquidation. When a marriage ends, the community property is divided equally between the spouses, subject to specific rules and deduction for liabilities. First, we have the Section 1, General Provisions. In Article 88, the absolute community of property between spouses shall commence at the precise moment that the marriage is celebrated. Any stipulation expressed or implied for the commencement of the community regime at any other time shall be void. So this means that all assets owned by the spouses at the time of the marriage, as well as any property acquired thereafter, become part of the community property. So it is important to note that any stipulation, whether express or implied, attempting to alter this commencement date is void. So for example, if a couple gets married on January 1st, 2024, and they had a house and a car before the marriage, those assets would become part of the community property. So, kato nga mga assets is part na to sa ilan nga marriage or sa ilan jud nga mga property. Any agreement stating that the community regime would begin on a later date, such as February 1st, 2024, would be legally invalid. That's about the Article 88. Now we have the Article 89. No waiver of rights, shares, and effects of the absolute community of property during the marriage can be made except in case of judicial separation of property. So, in this article, it addresses the possibility of waiving rights and shares in the absolute community of property. So this waiver is only permissible in the case of judicial separation of property, so which is a legal process that separates the property of the spouses. So waivers made during the marriage outside of the specific circumstances are deemed void. Next, we have the Article 90. The provisions on co-ownership shall apply to the absolute community property between the spouses in all matters not provided for in this chapter. This means that the general principles of co-ownership, such as the right to share in the fruits of the property and the obligations to contribute to expenses, apply to the community property unless explicitly superseded by the provisions of the family code. So for instance, if a couple owns a house as a community property or a part of a community property, the rules of co-ownership would apply to the rights and responsibilities regarding the house. So this includes aspects like sharing the rental income from the house if it is leased or kanang gipaabangan siya. So magtunga gyapon siya sa rental income or ilang ma-income adto then or contributing to the cost of repairs and maintenance. So naay co-ownership. Next, we have the let's proceed to the section 2. What constitutes community property? So unsa ang community property. So, in Article 91, unless otherwise provided in this chapter or in the marriage settlements, the community property shall consist of all the property owned by the spouses at the time of the celebration of the marriage or acquired thereafter. So, in this Article 91, it outlines the general rule regarding what constitutes community property. So, unsay kanang maila sa spouses. So unless specified otherwise in this chapter or in the marriage settlements, all property owned by the spouses at the time of the marriage or acquired thereafter become community property. So mamahimo to siyang community property. So for example, if a couple owns a house and a car before their marriage, so na sila kanang tagstagsa nga mga balay o car, and they purchase a new car during the marriage, all three vehicles would be considered community property. So if ang car sa bana, if nasa car before ang asawa po is na po car, so if before nga marriage sila, then after nga na married sila, purchase sila isa ka car, so ang tulo na kabuk car which is considered nga ilahan na to nga community property. So ilahan na to nga property. Then Article 92. So, the following shall be excluded from the community property. Property acquired during the marriage by gratuitous title. So, like for example, gifts, inheritances, and bequests received by either spouse during marriage are considered separate property, unless the donor or testator or grantor explicitly states it should be part of the community property. So, ano mga gifts, so dili na siya ma-considered as a community property if walay ka ng marag ka ng testament or mga states nga part na siya sa community property. Then second is property for personal and exclusive use of either spouse. So this category includes items like clothing, personal hygiene products, and other items that are clearly intended for the individual use of one spouse. However, jewelry shall be form part of the community property kay marama na siya ganang investing ng mga jewelries. So, third is property acquired before marriage with legitimate descendants. If a spouse had legitimate children from previous marriage, any property they owned before the current marriage along with its fruit and income remains their separate property. Article 93. The property acquired during the marriage is presumed to belong to the community unless it is proved that it is one of those excluded therefrom. So, in this article, it establishes a presumption that property acquired during the marriage belongs to the community. So, this presumption holds unless it is proven that the property falls into one of the categories excluded from the community property. So, this presumption places the burden of proof on the party claiming that the property is not part of the community. So, for example, if a spouse purchases a piece of land during the marriage, so it is presumed to be community property. If the other spouse claims that the land was purchased with separate funds, they would need to provide evidence to support this claim and rebut the presumption. Then next, we have the Article 94, the absolute or let's proceed to the Section 3, which is charges and obligations of the absolute community. So first, we have the Article 94. So the absolute community of property shall be liable for. First is the support of the spouses, their common children and legitimate children of either spouse. However, the support of illegitimate children shall be governed by provisions of this code on support. So this means that the community property is responsible for providing for the basic needs of the spouses and their common children. This includes expenses related to food, shelter, education, clothing, and healthcare. Second, all debts and obligations contracted during the marriage by the designated administrator spouse for the benefit of the community, or by both spouses, or by one spouse with the consent of the other. So, this means that the community property is liable for debts and obligations incurred during the marriage, provided they were contracted for the benefit of the community or with the consent of both spouses. Third, debts and obligations contracted by either spouse without the consent of the other, to the extent that the family may have been benefited. It includes taxes, charges, and expenses. So the community property is responsible for all the taxes, the charges, and expenses related to the community property, including major or minor repairs. All taxes and expense for mere preservation made during marriage upon the separate property of either spouse used by the family. Expenses to enable either spouse to commence or complete professional or vocational course or other activity for self-improvement. So, the community property covers expenses related to education and self-improvement for either spouse, including professional or vocational course. So, if one of these spouse or one go to school, so the community property covers those expenses. Antenuptial debts of either spouse insofar as they have redounded to the benefit of the family. So the community property is liable for antenuptial debts of either spouse to the extent that they benefited the family. So the value of what is donated or promised by both spouses in favor of their common legitimate children for the exclusive purpose of the commencing or completing professional or vocational course or other activity for self-improvement. Antenuptial debts of either spouse other than those falling under paragraph 7 of this article, the support of illegitimate children of either spouse, and liabilities incurred by either spouse by reason of a crime or a quasi-delict in case of absence or insufficiency of the exclusive property of the debtor spouse, the payment of which shall be considered as advances to be deducted from the share of the debtor spouse upon liquidation of the community. So, this means that these liabilities are borne by the debtor spouse separate property, but if insufficient, the community property may be used with the amount considered an advance to be deducted from the debtor spouse share upon liquidation. And lastly, which is the expenses of litigation between spouses, the community property is liable for litigation expenses unless the suit is found to be groundless. So, if the community property is insufficient to cover these liabilities, except for those listed in paragraph 9, the spouses are solidarily liable for the unpaid balance with their separate properties. This means that creditors can pursue either spouse for the full amount of the debt. So, next we have the Article 95. Whatever may be lost during the marriage in any game of chance, betting, sweepstakes, or other kind of gambling, whether permitted or prohibited by law, shall be borne by the loser and shall not be charged to the community, but any winnings therefrom shall form part of the community property. So this means that in the Article 95, it addresses the issue of gambling losses and winning. So any losses incurred during the marriage through games, whether legal or illegal, are borne solely by the loser and are not charged to the community property. However, any winnings from such activities become part of the community property. So if naka-income ana nga mga games, so part siya sa community property. So if kanang mapildi ang kanang mga utang, dili siya kanang responsible sa property both ninyo nga couple. So for example, if a spouse loses money playing poker during the marriage, the loss is their personal responsibility and not the community's. So conversely, if they win money playing the lottery, the winnings become part of the community property. Understand? So now let's proceed to the section 4, which is the ownership, administrative enjoyment, and disposition of the community property. So in Article 96, the administration and enjoyment of the community property shall belong to both spouses jointly. In case of disagreement, the husband's decision shall prevail, subject to recourse to the court by the wife for proper remedy, which must be availed of within 5 years from the date of the contract implementing such decision. So, this article states that both spouses have the right to administer and enjoy the community property. So, in case of disagreement, if dili mo magkasinabot, the husband's decisions prevail. So, matuman, which is ang husband, subject to the wife's right to seek a remedy from the court within 5 years from the date of the contract implementing the husband's decision. So, ang wife is pwede siya og remedy from the court within 5 years. So, if one spouse is incapacitated or unable to participate in the administration, the other spouse may assume sole administrative powers. However, these powers do not include the right to dispose of or encumber the property without court authorization or the written consent of the other spouse. So, any disposition or encumbrance made without such authority or consent is void. So, Article 97, either spouse may dispose by will of his or her interest in the community property. So this means that a spouse can leave their share of the community property to whomever they choose in their will. So pwede siya makapili ug asa nila iingon ang ilang property, i-dispose ang ilang will. So pwede sa iyang anak or sa spouse or asa iyang gusto niya nga ihatag ang iyang property. Then lastly, we have the Article 98. So, neither spouse may donate any community property without the consent of the other. However, either spouse may, without the consent of the other, make moderate donations from the community property for charity or on occasions of family rejoicing or family distress. So, in this article, it prohibits either spouse from donating community property without the consent of others. So, dili, ay prohibited nga ang usa ka spouse or like isa kang husband is mo dinit siyang property nga walay consent sa uban, but either spouse can make moderate donations from the community property for charitable purposes or on occasions rejoicing or family distress without the other spouse consent. Pwede rag dili ka need og consent nga magamit kasi sa inyong community property without the consent kay basta para siya for charitable purposes, mga occasions of family rejoicing or family distress. So, in conclusion, the absolute community of property regime in the Philippines establishes a framework for managing property relations between spouses. It defines the property that becomes part of the community, outlines the liabilities of the community, and establishes rules for administration, enjoyment, and disposition of community property. This regime aims to ensure fairness and protects the interests of both spouses and their children. Understanding these provisions is crucial for couples in the Philippines to manage their finances and property effectively during their marriage.